Hi, my name is Josh Epstein. I'm the marketing specialist for tdaperks. And Perks connects members to professional and life resources, insurance options, money and time-saving programs, CE resources, networking events, and more. So whether you're working within a DSO, private practice, or have a practice of your own, Perks is something for everyone at every stage of your career. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Surcharging in Dental Practices, the Pros, Cons, and Regulations. We will explore the impact of surcharging where patients cover the credit card processing fee instead of the dental practice. This approach, often marketed as credit card processing for free, has gained traction among some payment providers, but understanding the full implication is essential for making an informed decision. Phil Nieto, president of longtime Perks vendor Best Card, is here to answer the following questions and more. What is surcharging and how does it work? What rules do you have to follow to surcharge cards correctly? What are signs of programs that might be doing this incorrectly? And what are the penalties? How can I evaluate if surcharging patients is a good fit for my practice? And lastly, what other options exist to lower my cost to take payments? So Phil is the expert here, so I'm going to hand it over to Phil. Phil, thanks for being with us.
No, thank you, Josh. So today we're going to look at, surcharging in the dental practice. It's something that a lot of dentists are hearing a little bit of buzz about, but sometimes there can be a lot of bad information out there. And really the goal today, there's enough salesmanship and, heavy sales speak in like the credit card processing industry. There's a lot of terminology that sometimes is like really confusing and you're not exactly sure like what that means for your business. The goal today is let's kind of just, it's not a sales pitch. Let's break through kind of what are the options and kind of what does this look like if you want to implement it in your practice? Like, what should you need to know before you kind of decide whether this is something you want to do? So a little background about Best Card. We originally began as part of the Colorado Dental Association. Essentially, they had so many members that complained that this was an industry that they just felt like their practice was sometimes taken advantage of. So they created a program for their members. It became very, very popular. And we kind of just grew through positive word of mouth as we started to go nationwide. We've been endorsed by tdaperks since 2009. We work with hundreds and hundreds of TDA members. And we've been endorsed by ADA Member Advantage since 2020. So we currently work with more than 10,000 dental offices nationwide. In 2024, we saved dental offices more than $7.2 million on credit card acceptance fees. So if that's the goal, how do we make sure that the costs that the office is paying for taking credit cards, the goal is really how do we make sure that's as low as possible? Surcharging is a good option in that space, but it's not the only option, and it's not necessarily one that every practice might feel the need to kind of jump in on. So before we kind of start, we'll kind of look at the basics with surcharging, like really, how does it work? From there, we'll go into the rules. The rules are really, really important with surcharging, as we'll kind of get into. So we'll look at what do you have to do it correctly, and then what are signs of programs that are doing this incorrectly? Are there penalties for that? Last, we're going to kind of evaluate the pros and cons and kind of the full range of options. So how do you make sure that this is a good fit for your practice? What data do you want to look at? We'll kind of throw some numbers out that you can use to kind of like think about it. And then if you don't decide that, hey, surcharging might not be something you want to do, what are the other options to make sure that you're lowering your costs when you take payments? So I like to break up every section with a little bit of like marketing myth versus reality. So a doctor was nice enough to send this piece that they got sent, as a text message to their phone over. So Dr. Blank, the card processing rules have changed. Our company eliminates 100% of card processing fees. So marketing claim, there are new changes in credit card rules that allow you to run cards at $0 costs. Well, that's not true, right? So first, the rules that allow surcharging have been around since January of 2013. So there's really nothing new about surcharging, right? It was part of a class action settlement against the card brands. On top of that, the cost for accepting cards, it's not free. There's no $0 cost. It's passed on to the customer. So the card brands still collect their fees for running credit cards regardless of who pays. In this case, it's the customer paying instead of the business, right? So people that think that all of a sudden there's some new, rule in place that they can have no cost when they take cards, it's not really how it works. We will actually come back to this message because there's a couple of different whoppers, right, in that, small 2 sentences. And this company is actually one of the ones that we have seen doctors fined for signing up with. So we'll come back to this. So surcharging, what is it, right? Well, anytime the business accepts a credit card, there's a fee to run that card. While a lot of cardholders might not know that, a lot of businesses have learned that lesson the hard way, because a lot of times those fees are one of your bigger monthly costs that you're paying on a regular basis, right? Now, the fees include like fees from the card brands. Those set fees that every credit card processor shares are known as interchange and assessments. That's the hard cost to run any credit card. Doesn't matter who your credit card processor is, doesn't matter if you're on a flat rate. That's the fee behind the fee, right? So every credit card processor has the same interchange and assessments, and what they charge on top of that is where they compete. Well, those fees include what you're paying like your credit card processor, right? That's what's on top of that interchange and assessments. Surcharging basically allows you to add an extra fee to the transaction that covers your processing costs, interchange, and assessments. So, as an example, as a dental office, you're set up for surcharging at 3% for credit cards. A customer comes in and pays $100. The office then adds as part of the transaction a $3 extra fee, so you pay a total of $103. At the end of the day, the business then keeps $100, the payment processor keeps $3. So because that business is passing through the entirety of the transaction cost as an additional fee, the business really doesn't pay like a fee when like, surcharging. Now that's specifically on credit cards. We'll talk about debit cards in a minute. So as far as like a breakdown of this, because one of the questions you should always ask is, hey, if I'm doing this, what's the incentive of the person selling it to me, right? Well, here's an example, like interchange nationwide for all of our dental offices is about 1.68%. So we actually overestimated it here, but it does change a little bit depending on the type of card that's used, right? So in this case, 1.7% plus 10 cents per transaction is the interchange fee. We have a 0.15% assessment fee. So we take those fees out of the $3 transaction, and basically, there's a $1.05 like processor profit from that $3 that was like the processing fee there. So essentially, when credit card processors are selling this, there's a very substantial profit margin, more than 1% that they're making. We're always like to be really transparent. Our pricing on our TDA and perks endorsed like program, we make 0.3%. So like less than a third of what like this credit card processor would be making on this transaction. So when you're looking at surcharging, it's kind of important to remember this is something that is very, very lucrative for credit card processors. And honestly, if they're not playing by all of the rules and regulations that they should be playing with, it can be even more lucrative. We'll look at one of those coming up. So we're gonna go back to that same message before, the marketing myth versus reality. So this is the second line. You can eliminate 100% of card acceptance fees. Well, that's false. There is federal law, state law, and card brand regulations that all come into play in different ways, right? First, as far as like the federal law, basically as part of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, there are limits on basically being able to surcharge debit cards. Essentially, there was part of the law that lowered the cost of debit cards substantially. Most debit cards run at a rate of 0.05%, which is an incredibly low rate. It means you would pay $5 in fees on $10,000 in credit card, like a $10,000 credit card processing transaction. So when they lowered that cost, they also said, hey, you're not allowed to surcharge on top of that for debit cards. So for that reason, the card brands do not allow any surcharging on debit cards if you are surcharging correctly. So their rule is that the payment system needs to be able to recognize the debit card even without a PIN, even without choosing to run as a debit. The system has to know immediately whether it's a debit card, and you are not allowed to pass through a surcharge on those cards. So when they claim that there's 100% of card processing fees that you can offload, well, that's not really true. And if they do try to make that true, there are systems to try to get around this, you run into problems. So what are those rules for surcharging correctly, right? Well, as we discussed, surcharging rules, they can be a little complicated. There are companies that are selling services that, might not be compliant with those. It can open you up to penalties. So how do you make sure that a surcharge is compliant? And then what are the potentials for charging incorrectly? Well, as I mentioned, surcharging, kind of a regulatory headache currently. So there are some states that limit surcharging. So for example, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it is entirely banned. Texas did have a ban until 2018, but actually there was contested in court, and that ban was actually struck down. So in Texas, you are allowed to impose a surcharge. So once again, there's no state law that prohibits it, but you do have to make sure that you're following the regulations from the card brands, even though surcharging is allowed in Texas. So the first piece, in general, you are not allowed to make a profit from a surcharge you impose. So the surcharge fees have to match exactly what your business paid. So for example, our average dental office in Texas pays around 2% in fees, right? If you were to add a 3% surcharge, you would be making about a 1% profit on top of that. You're not allowed to do that. So generally, when you look at surcharging, you're going to see that the processor is setting a flat rate that matches exactly what the customer is paying. So if you are basically running transactions and there's a 3% surcharge, 3% also needs to be the fee that the credit card processor takes in, right? Second piece, you are absolutely not allowed to surcharge debit cards, only credit cards. And your system has to know the difference. Every credit card that you have, if you look at the first 6 digits of the card, that's something called a BIN, a bank identification number, right? You can look up, if you go online and Google, BIN lookup, you can find where you can have, there are websites where you can put in the first 6 digits, and it'll say, oh yeah, this is a Chase, this card, it's a high-end rewards credit card, or it's a, American Express, card, or Bank of America debit card. That first 6 digits tells the system exactly what type of card it is. So when you run a debit transaction, the system knows whether it's debit or not. You cannot allow a surcharge on those transactions. The amount that you're allowed to surcharge is also limited. So a surcharge on credit cards cannot exceed 3% for Visa and 4% for the other card brands. Basically, that is a hard and fast rule where if they see surcharging above that amount, there's a problem. Next, a surcharge must be clearly visible as a surcharge on the transaction receipt, in addition to being reported in specific data fields during the transaction. So if there's a surcharge and it's not labeled as surcharge, like for example, we had one office that was fined recently because the company that they had set up the system with called it a cash adjustment to try to get around the rules. That doesn't pass muster. You have to label it as a surcharge, otherwise you get fined. Next, you have to give notice to patients at the front of the practice, on any payment location, so like any checkout station, on your website, and on all billing materials that you impose a surcharge. That is really important. That's also something that they have sent around mystery shoppers to check for. Also, if you're going to have a surcharge on any credit cards, you have to surcharge all cards. You can't pick and choose. You can't turn it off for one transaction because you don't want to charge it to that customer. If it's surcharge is turned on, that's something that you have to use consistently. And last, you have to register your business that you're going to surcharge before implementing it in the practice. One thing I mentioned, most credit card processors will take care of this step for you, like we do, but we have seen some that did not get registered, and that's a problem. So you always want to make sure that you verify that it was reported. There's a little certificate that they have once that's been reported. The big thing here is that ultimately it's the responsibility of the practice to ensure that you are complying with all of these regulations. Bestcard as a credit card processor can set you up for surcharging. We can handle all the pieces that we, have a direct hand in. But when it comes to making sure that payments are notified, or making sure that there's notification at any payment location, there are steps that you need to make sure that you're doing. And if you're not following these steps, even if some other company signs you up for it, telling you that it was okay, you are the business that will get fined, not the credit card processor. So when we look at non-compliant programs like that, what are they sometimes called? How can you tell that you're looking at something that might not be compliant with the rules, right? So one of the things that people tried to do to get around a surcharge is by calling it something else. Oh, no, we don't do a surcharge. What we have is a cash discount program. Now, there are compliant cash discount programs and there are non-compliant cash discount programs. So for example, if you would normally charge $200 and instead you charge $195 because they're paying with cash, that's 100% allowed. You can always discount the stated price any way you want, right? But if you say, hey, the price is $200, but that is our cash only price, and then you add an extra 3% fee on top of that for a total charge of $206, anytime the terminal is calculating and adding a percentage fee, that's not compliant. Other companies have tried to claim that they have some legal loophole to get through this, but really, truly, the card brands have been cracking down on this aggressively, really starting in April of 2023. We're going to see one of those coming up, so just remember that. Another way that they try to get around surcharging regulations is by saying that they have a dual price. Oh, we list everything as like, here's our two prices for every single thing. So the state of New York, for example, had guidance on how to list the surcharge, and their state laws actually require listing both fees. So it's a really good example of what you're allowed to do. So on the left-hand side is a dual pricing option at the very top, right? Here's the credit card fee to run that, and then here is a cash fee. Generally, the rules are still pretty much in place that if the credit card machine is calculating an extra fee, you need to be the one that, that is going to be something that falls under surcharge regulations. So while this is a little bit more of a gray area, like cash discount programs really, aren't compliant, and that's pretty well acknowledged at this point. Dual pricing is a little bit more of a gray area, but I do recommend, do your own research. If you're thinking about a program with this, it might even be worth engaging a lawyer to make sure this is something that they think you're allowed to do. What are the consequences of noncompliance? Well, this is an example. This actually was an office in Texas. So essentially the story here was they left us briefly because somebody said, hey, we can offer a program where you don't pay any credit card processing fees. We'll look at exactly what that looked like for the patients in a minute. But within 2 weeks of switching to that program, this was the notice that they got from Visa because a patient had basically complained that they had implemented a program that was surcharging incorrectly, right? So essentially, right off the bat, they were assessed a $1,000 fine per location. On top of that, they always note that, like, hey, you have to reply almost immediately. So I didn't pull it out from the left-hand side, but essentially they had to respond within a week and a half, proving that they were no longer surcharging in a non-compliant method. Otherwise, it was going to be a $5,000 fine that was then assessed. The next month after that would be $25,000, and the month after that would be $50,000 a month in fines. So it is one of those things the card brands take very seriously. They go after very aggressively. They also note that they basically intend to send mystery shoppers back into the location to basically see if there's any rule violation after they've solved this issue. So if they say, hey, we're no longer surcharging in a non-compliant way, but they keep doing it, they're actually physically sending shoppers into locations, and we are hearing about this all the time. I have my pick of dozens of these notifications from offices that have contacted us saying, hey, I were set up incorrectly by a previous credit card processor. In an interesting note, the text message that we saw at the very beginning of this presentation was from the company that this dental office signed up with. So luckily we were able to help them respond to everything and get compliance systems in place. But it is something you need to be really diligent in protecting your practice, because a salesperson swearing up and down that something is compliant is not really the case. You need to know the regulations and make sure that you're complying with them. This is from that same email, the second page. So the policy where you see the customer complaint up above in the top left, this was what the company gave them. So you'll see that basically for any payments made with your debit or credit card, a 3.95% fee will be added to your receipt. Well, because we've been talking about this, we know the problem's right there immediately. 3.95% is more than Visa says you're allowed to charge. Debit cards cannot be surcharged. And once again, just because they tried to call it a cash discount does not mean that it's a cash discount. So they gave the regulations on the bottom, but actually the piece at the very bottom, once again, is imperative that the merchant understands that surcharging on debit is strictly prohibited. I can't tell you how many offices we have talked to about this. We're like, hey, these are the regulations. We're happy to get you set up in a compliant way. That's a big part of why we're endorsed by the TDA perks and ADA member advantage. But I've had offices that are like, oh, I think I'll find someone that will let me surcharge everything. This is the letter you can kind of expect to receive. The Visa complaint form to report any business really takes about 1 to maybe 2 minutes to complete online, and then you will be getting one of these letters. So we have seen so many of these that we're that's why we're making a point to do so many of these webinars right now, letting dentists know these are the ways you can and can't implement a surcharge in the practice. So after having covered all that, the marketing myth versus reality. You can have your credit card machine at an extra fee, but as long as you call it a cash discount where all listed prices are cash, it's okay to add any extra fee to any type of card. Well, false. Just because you call it a discount or dual pricing doesn't mean that you get to circumvent those regulations. So you want to make sure that any surcharge system you put in place in the practice is going to comply with those rules. So we've talked a little bit about the surcharging regulations and how they can be a little bit complicated, but that is kind of the secondary question. The real question is like, is this something that's worth implementing in your practice, right? So in this section, we're going to look at the pros and cons of adding a surcharge. Like, how do you make an informed decision? How do you know what numbers to kind of keep an eye out for, right? Second, if not surcharging, like what should the merchant processing fees be in the practice? How much might you be overpaying? If you said, hey, the surcharge isn't the direction I want to go, you still want to make sure that you're protecting your bottom line as much as possible, right? And then last, what are the best practices to follow in the office when accepting cards to lower your overall costs and any kind of risk of a disputed charge from a customer? Well, pros and cons. I always like to start this section by saying like it looks a little lopsided, but I would actually encourage anyone who's looking at it to actually really think about the impact on the practice, right? So the first pro is really a big one. It removes a fee that the office pays that can be very expensive. That is not a little thing, right? Most dental offices, after you look at your cost for like rent and staffing and maybe like your consumables, a lot of times your credit card processing bill might be one of the largest bills you're paying on a monthly basis, right? We save the average dental office more than $6,600 per year, but like that's because credit card processing costs are expensive, right? So as a pro, removing a fee that you pay on a regular basis can be a big deal, especially because we know that like, insurance remittances that dental offices receive have really not kept pace with inflation. If you're fully in network, you may not be able to adjust pricing. This seems like a great way to kind of work around those limitations. So yeah, like can be a big benefit to the office. The other benefit, it also encourages patients to use debit cards, which like we talked about, they have a lower cost to run. With a credit card, you're paying for the risk that they don't pay their bill at the end of the month. You're paying for the perks and rewards on the card and just like general fraud concerns, right? Well, with a debit card, there's a lot less of that. You actually, there's no perks on the card, right? The money's either in the account or it's not. There's no risk that they're not going to pay their bill at the end of the month. So debit cards generally run at much, much, much lower rates than credit cards. Getting, more people to pay that way can be a benefit to the practice too, right? The cons, though, can be pretty intimidating. So one of the biggest ones, and we will dive into this more on the next slide, it can upset your patients and increase patient attrition. That is a big deal. I mean, that can be the difference between a thriving dental practice and a shrinking one, right? Next, surcharges may cause decline with HSA or flex spending cards. Some HSA and flex spending cards are actually issued as like fixed limit credit cards instead of debit cards now, and those cards will not go through with a surcharge, right? Basically, surcharges are coded in a specific way and it's not compliant medical spending. Next, insurance payments on virtual cards. If your office is receiving these, those cards are issued with a fixed balance. So a lot of times they also will not allow for any additional charge to the transaction. If that charge is good for $172.31, adding a 3% fee will just cause it to decline. Now, we do talk about virtual cards coming up as a tip to lower costs. So this is one that, like you said, some offices may have already made changes on this, but just know taking those cards becomes difficult, or you have to end up calculating backwards what you can charge while adding the 3% fee, because you can't turn it off on a one-by-one basis for surcharging cards. It can also lead to an increase in accounts receivables. This has been kind of a big surprise to some offices that took it up. Accounts receivables, a lot of people will decide, hey, I don't want to pay the extra surcharge, and we'll look at why coming up, right? But essentially with that, oh, I'll come back next week with a check, or I'll come back next week with cash. Well, it's not even malice. People just forget. Everyone lives busy lives. Getting paid while the person is in the practice is a big part of making sure that you're not writing off a lot of, unpaid bills at the end of the year. So it is a big deal to kind of minimize your accounts receivables. That's one of the other things to think about with surcharging, is it generally does lead to a pretty substantial increase. Next, you can't write off the merchant processing fees on credit cards for taxes. So normally when you pay your taxes, when you pay any kind of business expense, that is a line item deduction that you can take from your taxes to make sure that that's not counting as part of your income. Well, with surcharging, there's additional income of that 3% that's being paid by the patient. So all of a sudden, you're not getting that benefit of being able to write that off. So depending on your tax bracket, whatever savings surcharging is providing, you might be losing 40% of that savings right off the top if you're in a high income bracket, right? Last, and we talked about this before, the complicated and potentially changing regulations and state laws can be hard to keep up with. If there's a new law in place by a state, if there is a change in how regulations work, and like I said, there was very substantial changes to this just in April of 2023, well, then your whole system might have to be updated. What you're doing now may not even be allowed. Those things are kind of, it's a moving target to keep up with. So, like, as far as like what you're considering before surcharging then, well, what is the impact on customers, right? I'm actually going to start at the bottom of this. We do credit card processing for thousands and thousands of dental offices, more than 10,000, right? In 2024, the average dental office transaction was $311, right? So a 3% surcharge on that $311 is $9.33. That's an interesting number because it's just enough for people to really kind of notice and care, right? If you're getting a 3% surcharge at 7-Eleven, it might be a little bit of a different ballgame compared to getting a $300 surcharge on dental services because it's a much larger transaction. If you're receiving a really high-end treatment, like, oh, this is a really extensive case, all of a sudden, somebody paying $5,000 has a very substantial additional fee for using their credit card, right? So when we did dental specific patient surveys, 71% of patients said they would strongly consider switching providers if given a surcharge for using their preferred payment method. Just for frame of reference, there were 5 answers to that question, and strongly consider switching providers was the most extreme negative option. So 71% of people, they were angry enough that they were like, hey, this is something I would strongly consider making a change, not just, it's kind of in the back of my mind. Now, I think, people tend to report that type of negative stuff aggressively, but if even 1 in 10 of those 71% of patients actually would make a change, that's a big difference to the practice, right? In general, the average patient will spend about $4,500 over their lifetime with the practice. So looking at the dollars and cents, 71% of people said it's enough to make them consider a switch. Is $9.33 on the transaction worth the potential $4,500 you might be missing out on that patient? What's not even factored in here is your marketing cost to bring in patients, right? If you're a fee-for-service practice, if you're doing marketing, you might be spending $100 just to bring a patient in the chair and losing them over $9.33. So I always want to be really clear with this. When it comes to alternatives, there are a few options to surcharging, and one that I always feel like it's important to talk to dental offices about is the option for them to raise prices. Now, I know sometimes you are locked into insurance agreements that haven't had price adjustments in years, but you're locked into that price and can't charge more for you're not a fee-for-service practice. That said, what I always kind of lay out to offices is if you as a dental practice have the ability to adjust your prices, if you were to raise your fee for service 3%, right? So doing the exact same thing as a surcharge, but it's just part of the price. It's not a separate line item. What we've seen is a lot fewer people get upset because people don't generally know what dental services should cost, right? And then where I said before, credit card processing is really lucrative to the credit card processor with making more than 1% on average on top of that. Well, that would be you making that instead of, the dental office. So if you're trying to get your overall cost to around 2%, a 3%, additional increase in what your stated price is would really mean that you're the one bringing in additional profit, right? Generally, as a credit card processor, I'm one of the few that will tell you I think that's completely fair. You're the one that's doing the work. I'm not, right? You're the one that's providing dental services. I'm not. So while surcharging is something that Best Card is happy to offer, I do always want to make clear, you do have the option to just raise your price and then you're making the profit instead of me. Now, the bottom line there, really surcharging can be a better fit for some practices than others. And you really want to think through what are the knock-on effects that I might not be thinking of now that it can have on your practice. Hopefully the pros and cons really help to kind of outline that. I will say, different types of practices do better with surcharging than others. So, for example, if you are a specialist, a lot of times you're not having to have that long-term relationship with a patient. If there's a surcharge, yeah, they might not come back, but they weren't coming back anyway. If you're a general dentist, a pediatric dentist, an orthodontist, that might be more difficult because you do rely on those repeat patients, right? I do always want to reinforce credit card processors make a very high margin on this type of pricing. So, if they're aggressively selling it to you, that's because it's great for them. You want to think about whether or not it's great and going to be lucrative for you. I did mention before, our average TDA practice pays around 2% in fees. So if you think about it that way, is the potential of losing one patient out of 50, if you're losing more than one patient out of 50, then that 2% cost, it may not be saving you, right? Essentially, have you ever been to a business that like charged you an extra fee to pay by card? How did you feel about that experience? How did you feel about the business that added it? If you think, hey, that's something that I still remember because it just really rubbed me the wrong way, is that the feeling you want your patients walking out the door with? Once again, surcharging is an option we are happy to make available. I just want to kind of provide the information that I would use to see if it was a good fit for my practice. So the marketing myth versus reality, well, patients won't care about surcharge, so it won't hurt your business. That is a claim I hear all the time from aggressive salespeople. Well, if you Google, what kind of businesses are disproportionately hurt by surcharging? Well, it's businesses that rely on repeat business from clients, that have other competitors nearby, that have a more expensive average transaction because once again, then they're seeing a more expensive surcharge, and that disproportionately rely on positive reviews and word of mouth. Every dental office is different, but a lot of those pieces are a pretty shared piece for a lot of dental practitioners. So we've talked about credit card processing costs. Well, surcharging, we know now how that works. We know how you're allowed to do it. And we know the pros and cons to maybe look at whether or not it's a good fit for the practice. If you decide, hey, that's not something I want to do, I don't think that's the end of the conversation, right? You still want to make sure that you are getting a great deal to kind of really minimize your bottom line fees. So in this section, we're kind of going to talk about some of the basics. What should you know about credit card processing? If you want to negotiate your fees with your payment provider or find another payment provider, what do you ask for? What should you be looking at to really understand your costs, right? And then next, what are the best practices that your staff can follow every time you're taking a payment to minimize those fees even further? I do want to say the order here is important because if you are following these best practices to minimize your fees, but you haven't negotiated with your payment provider, well, then you might just be boosting their bottom line instead of your own. So getting, competitive fees and getting good rates, then following it up with making sure that your in-office policies are, really tuned to do as well as possible can really make a big difference. So one of the questions I think a lot of dental offices don't really know, right? What should I be paying? What is my cost to run transactions? A lot of offices don't even realize what they're paying in general. It's just something like, oh, I grumble about this because it's a high fee. Well, one of the things that you need to do, and if there's nothing else that everyone here does today, take take your effective rate for the month. So effective rate is something that kind of works around any one rate or any one fee and kind of brings everything together. So you need to find the total amount that you paid in all your credit card processing fees. Normally you'll get this on a monthly statement, but sometimes there will be additional fees that don't show up on that statement that you also need to factor in, right? So you take the total amount that you paid in fees and divide that by the total processing volume, the total amount that you ran in credit card sales. When you do that math, that gives you an effective rate. So luckily, Best Card, we work with thousands of dental practices, and we did thousands of comparisons over the last several years. In 2024, the average dental practice paid about $3.59 or 3.59%. So $3.59 for every $100 is what their average cost was. That's high. Honestly, most dental offices don't know what they should be paying, and they realize, oh man, I didn't even realize this was a high number. 3.59% is a lot. That has actually gone up a lot too in the last several years. In 2019, the average dental office was paying 2.98% and running $30,000 in credit cards. In 2024, they're now paying 3.59% with other providers and running almost $46,000 or a little more than $46,000 in payments. So normally you think, hey, when I do more of something, I should get a better deal. What dental offices are seeing right now is that they're paying a higher percentage on an even larger transaction base, right? We like to be really transparent. With Best Card last year, the average dental office paid 2.27% on the rates we offer all TDA and ADA members, right? Now, basically, our costs when you run a transaction are the same as any other credit card processor. So if their fees are higher, if they're paying 3.59% compared to our 2.27, well, what that really reflects is that they have a lot higher profit margins on the account directly added by your credit card processor. There's all sorts of claims, oh, are there such thing as medical rates? Are there special rates that I get as a loyal software user? Well, yeah, they can charge you, whatever they want to claim, they'll charge you. But at the end of the day, the underlying cost that every credit card processor shares, no one gets a better deal, right? So understanding those costs is important, really understanding the basics, right? As I said before, credit card processing can be complicated. You look at your fee, you look at your monthly statement, and you don't understand most of the fees. So we're going to break it down here and what really are the real fees or the made up fees? What are the different pricing methods at a really high level? Some people oh, I get a flat rate of, 3.2% plus 20 cents per transaction. Well, that's not really a great deal when you actually understand the costs. So, what's the difference between these different rate structures, right? Generally, what I will tell you is that the further away your credit card processing fees are to, the actual cost paid, the higher of a premium you're going to pay. The more risk they're taking on, that certain types of cards might be more expensive, you're going to end up paying a higher amount on virtually every card, right? So there's almost limitless numbers of those additional fees to spot, but I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a list, right? So what are real fees versus made up fees versus negotiable fees, right? So a real fee, interchange and assessments. Every credit card processor has these same fees. Once again, there's no special medical rates that one credit card processor gets. Whenever a credit card is used, the type of card, how you accept it, and your type of business. So as a dental office, you have a service industry code of 8021. Every credit card processor boards those the same ways. As soon as you run that card, that interchange is paid regardless. It doesn't matter if you're a small business or a super large business. Interchange is the same. You're paying that same amount to the card issuer. So in that case, that's the bank behind a card. I might have my Chase Sapphire card. Well, interchange is paid to Chase. Assessments are the fees to the card brands. So that's what Visa or MasterCard make. Now, credit card processors may not show these two things on the statement, but that is always in the background of any transaction because that is their hard cost. That is the price floor that all credit card processors have, and everything to the right is where we kind of compete on top of that, right? So the negotiable rates, discount rates. If you're on interchange plus pricing, your discount rate is your plus that your credit card processor sets. A flat rate, if you've ever seen certain services where oh, it's 2.9% if it's card present and it's 3.5% if it's card not present. Tiered rates kind of breaks that down a little more where you might have several different tiers that cards can fall into. There's a whole lot of different pricing structures. Also on top of that, on negotiable are PCI compliance fees. Different credit card processors will have different rates there, right? Now, the biggest one, and honestly, the area where we see people pay the most is not in the fees that they spend time negotiating, but it's in the completely made up fees on the far right side, right? So, oh, I have my credit card processing through my dental software, but now every time I run payments, I see all of these additional transaction risk fees or risk assessment fees or settlement funding fees. If you're seeing any of these fees on the right, on the right-hand side, a lot of times those are just completely made up fees that the credit card processor is using to boost their profit margin while making it look like it might be a legitimate cost, right? So those made up fees a lot of times are one of the biggest areas where you can save money. So if you want to know what to ask for, like I said, today isn't a sales pitch. Today is just, if I was in business and this is what I was asking for, this is exactly where I would start. To get the best deal, you want to ask for interchange plus or cost plus pricing. What that means is that they're going to pass through that direct cost from the card brands, that interchange and that dues and assessments, and then their plus is their rate where they compete with other providers. What's great about that is your statement will be transparent. You can see exactly what you paid to your credit card processor versus what you paid to Visa or MasterCard. Now, often that could be a percentage fee and a per transaction fee, but we have seen some payments providers that are oh, you have a monthly membership that's $200. So we'll pass through interchange and maybe a small per transaction fee plus our $200 membership cost. Normally, when we break that down against our pricing that we offer through TDA Perks, it's actually a more expensive option, but just slightly more. It's not a crazy amount more. So getting that interchange cost passed through at cost is super important. One thing I will also mention though, some credit card processors will add in extra surcharges to the interchange line items and just hope that you don't notice, because it's, there's 1,200 different cards. Most people don't even realize that the fee isn't the correct one. So it is kind of one of those things where working with a reliable provider, have you heard good things about them? Do they have good reviews online? Really can make a huge difference for what you're paying overall. Most people didn't sign up to pay 3.59%. A lot of times you got offered a low rate initially and they raise that cost every few months. So even if you're negotiating the best deal, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be paying that long term. Now, in the interest of like full transparency, like I said, we've talked about what you should be paying today. These are our rates. We do interchange plus 0.3%. We lock that in for the life of the account, right? That's not something where we, every 3 months you're getting a little rate increase there that we're hoping you don't notice. We have people that have been with us for 17 years at this point that have never had a rate increase. Most credit card processors don't operate that way. A lot of times it's like negotiating your cable bill. You can get a great deal for 3 months, but what happens after that, right? In addition to that, we do a $100 equipment discount for any card readers you need as part of specifically for TDA members. We have a $15 monthly fee and a $36 annual PCI fee. And then we don't do like equipment leases. We don't do early termination fees. A lot of companies kind of like hide those things, and you realize, oh, I spent $2,000 on this card reader I could have bought for $300, right? Or it's going to be $900 to cancel, even though they've raised my costs so many times over the years. That's one of those things we actually train people to kind of avoid, right? On that pricing up above, we saved the average dental office last year $6,671, about 28% overall savings. And we do offer things that will automatically post into most of the popular dental software, have like website payments, text to pay, all that types of stuff. We built that out specifically for our dental offices. Dental offices are who we work with. So kind of if you want to have an offer in your back pocket, even if you don't want to reach out to us, if you want to have another offer to say, hey, I'm renegotiating with my prior credit card processor. Hey, I got offered interchange plus 0.3% plus 0 per transaction and $15 in monthly fees. I want you to meet it. We'd love to obviously work with you, but like I said, today isn't a sales pitch. Today is getting you good information that hopefully you can use in the practice. So, marketing myth versus reality claim. Well, you need your payment provider to set up surcharging for you, and only a couple of us are able to do that. Well, it's partly true and partly false. You will need your payment provider to set up a compliant surcharging program. Remember, your terminal has to be able to recognize whether it's a debit or credit card and then handle it correctly, right? And you'll have to register with the card brand. So that is something where you will need your credit card processor's help. The false part, virtually every payment provider, and like I said, this is not the good salesman in me, but virtually every payment provider can set you up with a system that's able to surcharge. That said, because of the regulations and how finicky those can be, and because there are companies that are kind of operating outside of it, you really want to make sure that from that section where we went through all of the pieces you have to do to surcharge correctly, that they are setting you up to surcharge correctly. It doesn't matter if they say, oh no, this is a workaround that gets around that. When Visa comes to find people, they're finding your business, not the credit card processor behind it. So, ways to save in the office. At this point, we've covered, hey, how does surcharging work? We've covered what you can do to lower your costs, and what can you do to really make sure that you're saving as much money as possible with your credit card processor. This is kind of the next step. If you have great pricing, these tips directly limit the interchange costs. Interchange costs, if you have a good credit card processor, should be 80% of your monthly bill, if not more, right? So lowering that cost can have a huge difference on your bottom line. I will use the example, our average office pays 2.27%. We legitimately have offices on the same pricing as all of those other offices who pay about 1% in credit card processing fees because they're really good at following these 3 tips, or these 7 tips. So the 3 big tips here are, first and foremost, try to take a payment while the patient is in the office. If you're running a card present transaction, and card present is chip, swipe, contactless payment, Apple Pay, Google Pay, all of that, right? If the card holder is physically present and paying with a physical card reading device, then you get a lower rate than if you were to key in that same card. So website payments, text to pay, a stored card in a vault will always be a more expensive interchange cost than if you had that patient there to make the payment while they're in front of you, right? 2, if you're keying in a card, so that situation where they are doing the card not present, right? They're doing it on a website, they're doing it on text to pay, they're calling in a card, they're mailing it to you. Your staff should know to always, always, always put in the 5-digit zip code and the 3 to 4-digit security code on the card. So basically, the reason why this is an anti-fraud check, right? Card not present transactions without the card physically there have a higher risk of fraud. When you put in that information that shows that you have direct info on like the card holder and direct info on the physical card, right? So the zip code and the security code, you get a lower rate. So that's really, really, really important. This was a thing that a lot of people don't realize. When you run that card as like card not present versus card present, it's usually about 0.3% more expensive, assuming you put in the zip code and the security code. If you're not putting in that zip code and security code, it can be 1.5% more expensive. So very, very important that every time your staff is keying in a card, they're putting in the zip code and the security code. Small additional benefit to that, not only will this lower your rates, but if you ever have a patient dispute a charge, this will also make it easier to win that dispute. Step 3, encourage the use of debit cards. So as I mentioned before, debit cards are usually a lot lower cost than credit cards. Most of the popular debit cards from any big bank run at a rate of 0.05%. So remember before we were talking like, 0.05% on a $10,000 credit card sale to that debit card, you would pay $5 in fees. A rewards card, like a high-end rewards card that you were running card present, that might cost 2.2%. So that same $10,000 sale is $220 in fees versus $5 on debit cards. So every time you have a debit card, you're probably saving money compared to a credit card. So one of the tips I give offices is train your front desk to ask for it, right? Instead of them saying, hey, do you have a credit card you'd like to pay with today? Verbally prompt, say, hey, do you have a debit card you'd like to pay with today? Some people will say, oh, no, I have a credit card. I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. But if 1 person in 5 chooses to use a debit card instead of a credit card, then you just saved a ton of money. Like that really does add up over time. Those offices that I mentioned before are taking 1% in like their overall credit card processing fees. Well, they're taking almost all of their payments card present. They're taking the vast majority in debit cards, and they're never forgetting to put in that AVS. Now, the next 4 tips are also important because it really can increase your costs. So HSA and flex spending cards usually run as debit cards. So encouraging their use is not only good for your patients because it's tax advantage spending, but it also saves you money, right? So make sure that you know that you can take those. Once again, any credit card processor can set you up to take HSA and flex cards. As soon as we board you as a dental office, as long as that HSA or flex spending card is coded for dental use, then you'll be able to accept it in the practice. You can't use those at 7-Eleven, but any dental practice should be able to accept those. Next, insurance payments. So those ones that are issued as a virtual card. I don't think it's any surprise, but those can tend to be the most expensive cards that you'll accept in the practice. So where I mentioned before that like a debit card can run at 0.05% and a high-end rewards card might run at 2.2%. Well, these insurance payments issued as virtual cards will usually start at about 2.5% and can go all the way up to 3.15%, right? So, these are the most expensive cards because they're business-to-business rewards cards, right? You can request alternate payment methods to take those cards. So all the time, you can request a direct deposit like an EFT. You can also request just a paper check. We are hearing feedback that some providers behind those EFTs are saying that they charge like 2.5% or more for that. I would just tell you that is going to be very, very negotiable as far as that rate because realistically, their costs on those direct deposits are pennies, if not fractions of pennies, right? So if you're receiving a lot of virtual cards, that might be an easy thing to change in the practice to lower your overall costs. Once again, that's bad for me as a credit card processor because we make money on the volume, but we also really have a big focus on saving dentist money, and this is a really easy way to do that, right? Next, voiding transactions instead of running refunds, that'll save you a lot of money. We don't charge fees on refunds, but some credit card processors do. If you void a transaction instead of refunding it, basically you won't pay any of the transaction costs like once that transaction is settled. So you're not paying the percentage on the original transaction. So getting your staff used to voiding on like the same day, patient was in and they decided, after paying, I actually wanted to use this card. Well, void it, and then just run it on the new card, that won't cost you anything. If you were to do a refund and then void, even if it's the same day, same scenario, you're going to end up paying transaction fees that you don't have to pay. And then the last one, and this is a personal pet peeve for me, PCI compliance. So if you're not familiar, PCI compliance is kind of like the HIPAA of credit cards, right? It's Visa and MasterCard's rules saying if you want to accept credit cards, these are what you have to do, and we want to make sure that you're compliant, that you're, handling card data in a secure way, right? Well, generally that's an annual questionnaire. It may also require scans of your network. There are ways to get around that, right? But essentially, when we do our comparisons, about 72% of dental offices that we do comparisons for are currently receiving PCI non-compliant fees. Now, those non-compliance fees can range from $18.95, and actually this is a little outdated. We've actually seen providers that are charging more than $250 a month in PCI non-compliance fees that are really easily avoidable. PCI is something that we really do take like a white glove approach to. When offices are with us, we will walk them through that entire process. So if you use us and you have a question about PCI, give us a call. We'll walk you through it. Your credit card processors should be helping you with PCI, but we find that a lot of them actually make PCI very difficult to complete because they realize, oh, we can make a lot of extra money on those additional non-compliance fees. So, these are the 7 tips that, like I said, in the practice, that thing you're doing every single day, these are kind of just like the best steps to follow to make sure that you're keeping that cost as low as possible. So, that's really, what we wanted to go over today. We went through surcharging, we walked through, kind of what those options look like, what you have to do when you set it up and make sure that you're setting it up correctly. And then if you don't decide to surcharge, what are the other steps you should be doing to really make sure that everything is just kind of going seamlessly and meets the needs of your bottom line for your credit card processing. Best Card is endorsed by tdaperks, ADA Member Advantage. We save the average practice about $6,671 per year. If you want to reach out to us, you can always email us at compare@bestcardteam.com. I would always say give us a phone call. Like, customer service is one of the things we're known for. So you can call us at 877-739-3952, or if you scan the code on the QR code on the left-hand side, that will also take you to a page where you can actually submit your statements to us, and we can give you a really detailed cost breakdown on exactly what we can save your practice. So thanks for the time today, and Josh, I'm going to kick it back over to you and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Great information, as always, expert in the field. Again, I do want to emphasize the customer service and member support that Best Card offers. So that is a big plus over there. Again, you can ask any questions right now that you'd like. You can put them in the question box. I didn't mention that in the beginning, but I'm mentioning that now. I do see some questions that have come in, but feel free to ask what you need to ask. So first question coming in is, our office charges an extra fee if someone pays and is not in the office. So website, phone, is that allowed?
So you can offer basically like convenience fees. It is a little bit murky, and basically it's kind of important how you do it, right? So say, for example, you have a $5 additional charge if someone is, making a payment, but they're not in the office. You can call it a bookkeeping fee, you can call it an administration fee, whatever you want to call it. The important thing is if it's a flat amount for every payment made that way, that's good, right? If it's calculated as a percentage, that's technically a surcharge. So you're kind of in murky territory again, and I wouldn't really recommend it, right? The second part to that is usually the rules on convenience fees, if they're added, is that there has to be a method to basically pay where you're not getting charged that convenience fee. So like the way you said it was perfect. If you're doing it only when they're paying and they're outside the practice, that's completely fine. If like every time they go to pay, there's also a $5 convenience fee, even if they're in the practice, that's not something that works. So it sounds like the way that you've done it is actually pretty good, but I would make sure that you're not doing it as a percentage.
Okay, and here's one more. Can we add a 3% service charge or an adjustment fee to get around the surcharge rules?
Yeah, no, that's one of those, like I said, if you're doing that, I would strongly recommend kind of reconsidering. It doesn't matter what you call that 3% fee. That one where I showed that fine notice, and like literally I have dozens of these I could have shown, right? Their credit card processor set up their system to list that 3.95% that they were charging as an adjustment, right? It doesn't matter what you call it. If there's a fee that's calculated as a percentage added to the transaction, Visa is very clear that they want it labeled as a surcharge and that they want it to comply with all of those surcharging regulations. So yeah, just calling it something else, unfortunately, doesn't kind of get you off the hook for the requirements regulatory wise.
Right. I see one more here that's come in. Again, ladies and gentlemen, you can type them in your questions in the question box there, and we'll make sure that we get them answered today. So here you go. It sounds like the maximum surcharge is 3 to 4%, but can I add a surcharge that is less than 3%?
So yeah, that's actually, we have had some offices ask about this. So say, for example, you want to add a fee that's 2% to patients, right? You can do that. Now, the important thing when you're setting that percentage, the percentage that you add as a surcharge can't be more than your costs, right? But your cost can be more than the surcharge. So say, for example, you wanted to have a 1.5% fee. Well, don't be surprised if your credit card processor still makes the fee 3% that you're paying, but maybe you want to go half and half with like your patients, right? You can do a surcharge percentage that's less than the amount that you're charged. You just cannot do one that's more.
Okay, don't see any more questions that have come in, Phil. So
Okay.
we're about at our hour anyway. But hey, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time and the information, your expertise. Everyone have a great weekend and be sure to tune into our next webinar next month. Thank you so much, Phil.
All right, thanks, Josh.
Hope we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.